Thanks for having me. Happy to be here again. My name is Monica McKenzie. I'm the bald eagle and snail kite biologist for FWC, and we're gonna get into the Everglades snail kite a little bit.
Monica, you could show your face too.
Oh, okay. There we go. Perfect. Okay. We can hear me and see me okay?
Yeah, you're good.
Perfect. All right. So today we'll be talking about the roles and responsibilities of my position as the bald eagle and snail kite biologist, some biology, ecology, and history of the Everglades snail kite, how the population has changed over time and factors that have affected them, and how habitat managers can help with their population succeed. So again, as the bald eagle and snail kite biologist, I'm going to touch on my roles and responsibilities as the snail kite coordinator. And if we have time at the end for questions about my roles and responsibilities with bald eagles, I would be happy to answer any of those questions as well. But I work with wetland habitat managers to ensure agency actions support snail kite recovery, as well as disseminate snail kite nesting information to our habitat managers in FWC as well as other agencies. I assist in securing funding for snail kite research, and I serve as the subject matter expert for this species. If there's questions in development or any areas that snail kites could be found. The Everglades snail kite is a federally endangered species listed in 1967. They are a wetland dependent raptor and extreme dietary specialists. They almost exclusively have foraged on Florida apple snails, Pomacia paludosa. But with the invasion of the invasive apple snail, they have started to forage on those as well. And their population increase can be partially attributed to that invasion. They are highly mobile and make large scale movements and are a subspecies of the snail kites that are found in Cuba, Central and South America. Their traditional breeding season is March through June, and we're going to touch on a lot of these topics further into the presentation as well. Some of the influences that have impacted snail kite populations have been degradation of habitat and loss of habitat. The overdrying of wetlands have impacted where they're able to forage and nest. And some of the marsh-like wetlands that they can be found in have encroaching vegetation that may lead to monocultures and limit foraging availability. Snail kites prefer to nest in sparsely vegetated open water and have a dense or woody structure as their nesting substrate, with that open water with sparse vegetation nearby for foraging availability as well. Like I mentioned, they are specialists when it comes to their food. They forage almost exclusively on apple snails. Here in Florida, we have the native apple snail, which is Pomacia paludosa. It has these larger eggs in their cluster, usually have 20 to 30 eggs in those clusters. Typically, they start out a bright pink and then transition to a light white color. The native apple snails are a lot smaller. You can see in this bottom left photo that the native apple snail is about the same size as probably a golf ball, compared to the invasive apple snail, Pomecia maculata, that's a lot larger, probably a similar size to a like a softball, something a lot larger. So these invasive apple snails were first found in the Kissimmee chain of lakes in central Florida in 2006 and have really started to spread across the state. They can outcompete the native snail since they do live a lot longer. The exotic apple snails can live up to 4 years compared to the natives that live 1 to 1.5 years. Their egg clusters are usually made up of almost 1,000 or sometimes larger eggs in one cluster, and they can lay a egg cluster once a week. The invasive apple snails do reproduce throughout the year, where the native apple snail usually reproduces in the spring, and they will die after the reproductive system. The invasive apple snail can tolerate much harsher conditions than the native. They are drought tolerant and are present in wetlands with poor water quality. The growth of the invasive apple snail has continued to grow across the state, as well as into Georgia and Tennessee and some of the southeast areas, as we can see in this map down here from USGS.
Monica, we lost your slides.
Oh, you lost them?
I still see them. You're good.
Okay.
Oh,
can see it.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So this image here is I pulled from eBird yesterday. I was looking at where snail kites have been seen within the last year. So like I mentioned earlier, snail kites can be highly mobile, especially in their first year of life, where they will go out and explore and look for food sources. So sometimes they can be seen outside of Florida. There's a location here in Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, even in Louisiana, that snail kites have been spotted in. There's not much of a food source for them in those areas. So typically when they are displaced to this areas where they don't have a food source, there's a low chance for them to actually get back to Florida. But I do see the rare birds alerts for them in different areas as well. But as you can see, they are kind of all over Florida, highly concentrated in these wetland areas. They can be found near Lake Okeechobee, all throughout the Kissimmee chain, Southwest Florida, and of course in the Everglades. There is a monitoring program that was established in 1982 by the Florida Co-op Unit, the University of Florida, Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, and the University of Miami. They monitor across the state of Florida and complete 6 intra-annual surveys that are spaced out about 3 weeks apart, starting in March. Surveys are completed by airboat and wetlands throughout Florida, and these surveys help get a good estimate of population trends year to year. During these surveys, they will document every kite that they see. They will document every snail kite nest location with GPS coordinates and monitor the nest status. Around 24 days old, they will ban the juvenile kites with these metal bands, and we'll get into that a little bit more. As well as a statewide crew, the monitoring program has a dedicated monitoring crew for Lake Okeechobee that complete more intense monitoring on a weekly basis, because there is a decent contribution from that lake system. So here we have a couple examples of what these bands look like. You can see on this right photo that there's a bright blue band on this juvenile snail kite. You can see the K over 47. So these are field readable bands. They're usually bright in color. These ones are blue. There are green ones, there are black ones, and now they are banding with red bands, field readable bands. These bands usually can be seen by binoculars or a camera lens or a spotting scope when the birds are perched. So if you do ever see a band, field readable band in the wild, and you are able to get a photo of it or even remember what the letter number combination of the band is, you could always email me that information and I would be able to find out more information on that specific bird. University of Florida does band almost every single juvenile kite that they are able to get their hands on. So there is a lot of information about where these birds are hatched, where they were spotted last, and where they are now. So that is great information, and my contact information will be at the end if you do want to email me with any questions or even band resightings. These bands also, or the birds also receive a metal band, the silver band here, that's issued by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That is not a field readable band. You have, there's multiple digits and letters that are on that band. So usually you can't read those unless the bird is in hand. But that's part of the monitoring program that's ran by University of Florida. And with that information that they're out collecting during the nesting season, we're able to get a estimated population for these birds. So the 2023 population was 2,820 birds. The last few years, that population has kind of hovered right around 3,000 birds. But we can see that back in 1997, there was a big decline and then a little bit of an increase in back down in 2009. There are a lot of factors that go into the increases of the population, but one of those one of the factors that probably one of many that helped increase that population in the mid 2000s were that invasion of the invasive apple snail. So as they were out competing the native apple snail, the adult snail kites did have some difficulty handling the larger snails. But studies from University of Florida have shown that over time, the bill length of snail kites started to increase. So the snail kites that had a larger bill length were able to access those larger snails more easily than those with shorter bill lengths. So as the bill length was increased over the population within wetlands that had invaded apple snails, so that's this bar in red is wetlands with invaded invasive apple snails, they had a higher heritability of that larger beak than areas that did not have or were not invaded by the exotic apple snail. So as a reminder, this photo up here, this B photo is a size difference of the native apple snail compared to the invasive apple snail. And you can see they have a nice large hook on it. So this graph here shows that the juvenile survival is positively correlated with larger bills. So those juveniles with larger bills had a higher chance of surviving in areas that were invaded by the exotic apple snail. And like I said, this was one of many likely factors that contributed to the population increase after the exotic apple snails were found throughout this, starting in the Kissimmee chain of lakes. So this graph here shows the relative annual contribution per wetland to the number of active nests. So these black bars represent the Everglades, and starting in 1994 throughout the mid 2000s, the Everglades contributed a nice proportion, mostly sometimes the higher end of the proportions for the whole state. The gray bars indicate the Kissimmee River Valley, including the Kissimmee chain of lakes. So, here in the mid 2000s is when that invasion of the invasive apple snail started to be found in the Kissimmee chain of lakes. And so they were able to provide a higher proportion of contribution throughout the state. Over time, other wetland areas such as the STAs, or the stormwater treatment areas, started playing a role in nesting. They started to nest in those areas, as well as other wetland areas. And we'll get a little bit further into like what those other areas may be as well. Earlier, I mentioned that the traditional season starts in March and runs through June, but these snail kites can be found nesting outside of that traditional season as well. So the surveys 1 through 6 here at the top, that is going to start in March and run through June. But they can be found nesting outside of that season as well. But the post bar, the light green bar that we see, does start in late June and goes through sometimes even November, December. We can find snail kites nesting. So over the years, there have been high contributions of successful nests outside of the traditional snail kite nesting season as well. So with the data we received from the monitoring program at University of Florida, we're able to work with our habitat managers to ensure safety of snail kites while continuing managing wetland systems. Disturbance and vegetation treatment buffers, prescribed fire management, and hydrology recommendations is the makeup of snail kites and habitat managers working together. An example of how I work with habitat managers, both within FWC and other agencies, is this map here on the left. This is a map of Lake Toho from the 2024 nesting season. This is survey 4, I believe. So using the nesting data that we receive from the monitoring crew, I create these maps with these individual icons of the nest locations. Usually the red indicates a failed nest, where green will be an active nest, and blue is a successful nest. Around each of those nests, I will create a red 500-foot buffer where we ask habitat managers not to enter into that area. Studies have shown that 500 feet is usually the area where the snail kites will start to become disturbed and leave the nest. And when they leave the nest, that leaves their eggs and chicks vulnerable to environmental conditions, to predators, things of that nature. So we want them to stay on their nest for as long as possible. So the habitat managers limit the amount of time that any time that they spend within 500 feet radius of the nest. The yellow buffers here are 500-meter no harmful alterations to the habitat or vegetation. So after a snail kite determines its nest location, we don't want to alter any of the vegetation that might be in that area where the snail kites can go and forage. Again, UF studies have shown that snail kites will travel up to 500 meters, sometimes more, but usually within 500-meter radius of their nest for foraging when they have eggs or chicks in the nest as well. So usually we try to leave those areas as untouched as possible. This map on the right is a zoomed in version of this cluster of nests here. But typically I will send these 500 feet buffers to airboat tour guide operators to limit that disturbance as well. They do not receive the individual nest locations, but they will receive the buffers, and we ask them to limit any activity in that area as well. This will help ensure that the kites in their nest stay safe, as well as not disturbing them. But as you can see, a lot of these nests are found right along a major trail on the lake. And for airboats, it can be sometimes be dangerous to travel in deep water. So we would never want anybody to jeopardize their safety. So if an instance like that comes up where they're not able to safely move around the 500 feet, we will limit them to continuously moving through an area, but still maintaining as far distance, usually no closer to 200 feet, but from the nest to help limit any disturbance to the birds, but mostly to ensure safety for the people as well. Prescribed fire is a tool in wetland systems that is used to manage aquatic habitats, and the snail kites can also benefit from. However, seasonality does play a huge role in what types of management can occur and to what extent. So a lot of coordination with our habitat managers take place because sometimes that management happens during nesting season. So we will work with habitat managers to review prescribed burn plans. If they are trying to prescribe a burn within snail kite nesting season, or if snail kites are currently nesting, we will work with them to survey the area before any treatment. Typically, we will plan those burns around when the monitoring crew is out monitoring those areas. But if the times just don't line up, I myself will go out there, monitor those areas, and make sure that there's no active snail kite nest before any treatment is applied. Sometimes I am able to help out just by being another body on the ground or on a boat and monitoring the fire as it's occurring. So this is an example of an area that has a dense monoculture up here in the top left photo. It's overgrown, it's dense, it's basically one species. And after treatment, it creates this nice biodiverse open water with sparse vegetation, marsh-like area that is ideal for snail kites to forage, and creates a nice, healthy, balanced, biodiverse ecosystem as well. That open water with sparse vegetation is ideal for snail kites to be able to forage. But as we can see in this bottom right photo here, that they've found that the invasive apple snails really enjoyed the disturbance after that vegetation treatment. So it only takes a few days for that vegetation to start to grow back, and then the apple snails will start their reproductive cycles, and they really enjoy that disturbed area. The snail kites are able to see the apple snails in the water a lot better after treatment because it is more open, it's less dense. They can see the apple snails better and have more foraging availability as well. So this is, we're getting into a little bit of the thicker stuff. So in my role, I do provide hydrology recommendations to create favorable conditions for snail kites based off of statewide models for each individual wetland that snail kites can be found on. So we have East Toho, Lake Toho, Kissimmee, Okeechobee, some of the water conservation areas. But I'm going to mostly be focusing on Lake Okeechobee for these nests, just so we're not covering too much here as well. So this graph on the left is the number of nests initiated per week based on the level of the lake stage. So the number of nests to be initiated when the conditions are favorable. When the lake stage is below 14 feet and above 15 feet, the initiation drops since the conditions are not favorable. So those snail kites really enjoy 14.8 feet. And so that would be the optimal lake stage in the beginning of their nesting season to create that, encourage that nest initiation and create the more favorable nesting conditions. So this, this graph here is the daily nest survival probability based on that same lake stage. The below 12.5 feet, the nest survival drops off. The probabilities, that nest survival probability does drop, but since it is a daily nest survival probability, if you multiply that over 60 plus days that it takes for the eggs to incubate and raise the chicks until fledge, it does make a big difference. So the lake stage on Lake Okeechobee should stay above 12.7 feet to maintain a littoral zone hydration. Keep that water underneath the nest, like I mentioned earlier, and enable to be able to deter predators from reaching active nest chicks and eggs. And another factor of daily nest survival probability is recession and ascension rates. So how quickly the lake levels are rising and how quickly the lake levels are receding. So if the lake levels are rising over 1/3 of a foot per week on Lake Okeechobee, that could result in the nest flooding and then allowing predators like an alligator to have more access to the nest. Where if the lake levels decrease too quickly, that can allow predators like the raccoon and the snake here and rats and other predators of that nature to be able to access the nest as well. So we try to keep an eye on different water bodies and make sure that the lake stages are right where they need to be and to help prevent that survivability. And so I know that was a little bit of the heavy stuff there. So again, I mentioned my roles and responsibilities as the bald eagle and snail kite biologist. We covered the biology and history of the snail kites and how the population changes over time and what factors affected those. And also covered how habitat management can help the populations succeed as well. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions that you may have. Again, my contact, my email is down at the bottom here, as well as my phone number. So feel free to email me, call me if you have any questions related to bald eagles or snail kites.
Okay, so you can either type it in the chat or you can
Okay.
write it yourself if you have any questions. We can answer them either way. What a fantastic presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Monica.
Thank you.
Anyone have any questions? I know I took a photo of a few years ago at Clay Island of a snail kite with a band, so I have to dig that back up so I can even, it was a few years ago, but still.
Yeah, I probably have some information on that bird somewhere, or I can also get it for you.
Okay. Oh, Karen says, very informative, thank you. Cindy really liked your photos. Okay, Monica put her contact information in there.
Yeah, there was a lot of information. So if more come to you later on, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to discuss any of this too.
Mm-hmm. It seems like in our area, we've been having a harder time finding snail kites compared to other years. Just that's my experience this year, but
Yeah, this year was so far this year in 2024 it's been a little bit less than the last few years, but if you saw in that population graph I showed, it's the last few years have kind of increased and decreased, so it's oscillating a little bit. But I do work right on Lake Toho, so I frequent Brownie Wise Park sometimes, and sometimes you get to see them flying around.
oh, I hope the young birders get to see them this Saturday. That would be awesome. They would love that. That's where they're going. Debbie asked, how many eggs do they typically lay?
Typically, they'll lay around 3, sometimes 4, but usually there's 2 to 3 chicks in the nest, or eggs in the nest as well.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, or you can ask questions about eagles as well?
Oops.
Okay, so Laura asks, has the recent storm around the Gulf impact your water levels?
That's a great question. Here in Central Florida, it did not impact like the lake levels here, but I know Southwest Florida has had a lot of rain this summer, so Harns Marsh in Lee County had some nesting pretty late into the season. I wouldn't say that it really has impacted our water levels so far, but it definitely, the rain in like September, the storm itself probably didn't impact it too much, or we haven't seen that, but the rain in September has definitely increased and allowed kites to nest in places like Loxahatchee Slough, Harns Marsh, and there's actually some active snail kite nests on Lake Okeechobee. So
that's good. Bob said, good presentation. Thank you. Deborah asks, how does hydrilla relate to populations?
that's a good question on hydrilla. To my understanding, the invasive apple snails do eat hydrilla or can be found in it, and it kind of creates a area for those snails to be on, so it allows the snail kites to forage more easily. But I don't know if there haven't been many studies on direct correlation with hydrilla. I know University of Florida did research on foraging efforts in areas that had hydrilla a few years ago, but that was more of like a wetland impoundment just to the west of Lake Toho.
Okay. All right. Any other questions, anybody? So I had a question. I noticed, I know, are they still calling them Everglades snail kite, or we dropped the Everglades?
So they are still called Everglades snail kite, since they are a subspecies from the snail kites that are found in Central and South America. There hasn't been much nesting the last few years in the Everglades, but they are still referenced to as the Everglades snail kite.
Helpful to know.
Yeah.
Okay. Last call for questions. Again, you can unmute yourself if it's easier than I know typing can be. I mean, I really enjoyed this. It's a great kickoff to our season for Bird Chat. I'm glad to be back.
I do have,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Well, everybody will be back this time next week with a different program.